Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt. I'm a wildlife photographer based in Northern California, and today we're talking about the RF100-500 f4.5 7.1 versus the EF 400mm f4 DO IS Mark II lens. Which one is sharper? Are they comparable? Do they perform as well as each other in a laboratory-like environment so that we can at least know what's possible in the field? Let's get into it. All right, so the first thing I want to do is just get out of the way that gear matters for wildlife photography, okay? It just does. It does because we shoot in really crazy situations where the light can be really low and it just requires pushing our gear to the maximum limit. Now, I am not suggesting that the person behind the camera is not the most important thing, or that's a lot of negatives. What I'm trying to say is you matter a lot, okay? Your mastery of technique, understanding the exposure triangle, understanding how to function your camera, how to operate it, autofocus capability, understanding framing, all of these things matter a ton. Bird behavior, wildlife behavior, all that stuff super duper important, okay? But unlike other forms of photography where you can put on a thrifty 50 millimeter 1.8 and you can get exceptional portraits, it's pretty hard in certain situations to get what you want when you don't have the right gear for wildlife photography, okay? So that's all I'm saying. Now, in this case, we've got one of the best lenses, really, the 100-500 RF f4.5 to 7.1 lens. It has two USM motors in this for autofocus speed. It is very, very fast. It performs very well in the field. I purchased this. This was the first lens that I bought, actually, with the R5. It's my first, lens when I switched over to Canon, and it performs really well. And I've taken this everywhere. Probably the most fun I had with this was when I took it to Makia Seal Island in the Bay of Fundy, border of Canada and Maine, and I shot puffins, and the lens just killed it. I mean, it really excelled. Okay, it was super sharp. Caught subjects, was a joy to shoot. The perfect lens for that type of situation when shooting from a hide. But I also shoot things like owls and birds, on the water, seabirds early morning before the sun has risen or after the sun is set at night. And this lens just does not perform in those situations. That f7.1, or if you're shooting 400, it's 6.3. It just lets in not enough light. And the sensor, even when you push it to ISO, 25,000 and above, it's just not enough, and it's frustrating. And so for those types of situations, I am on the lookout and have been for some time for a complementary lens to supplement this one that'll perform well in those low light situations, probably on a tripod, but in those types of situations. And that's what led me to the EF 400mm f4. And this lens was built about 5 years ago. It's still on the market, I believe. You can still get them on Canon's website. I got this one for $3,500, which is a real deal. They typically sell for about $4,000. And that sort of brings me to another point here, which is that both of these lenses sit roughly in the same price range, that sort of $2,500 to $4,000 range, the mid-range, if you will, for wildlife equipment. Very expensive, certainly a privilege to own these and to shoot with these, but also not the highest, not the lowest priced. At the low end, you have the 800 f11 and 600 f11 RF lenses, and the RF 100-400, which is a great lens, really. It just also suffers from kind of a low light situation, challenge in those types of situations. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got the RF 600mm f4 and 400mm f2.8, and the recently announced 100-300mm f2.8. And those lenses all cost about $10,000 or more. So super expensive premium lenses. Now these lenses are really in the middle ground. And in addition to some other options from the EF lineup, there aren't that many available, unlike some brands like Nikon that's really coming out with a lot of those mid-range wildlife options. But that's a separate video where I can rant. But for Canon right now, these are two of maybe a handful of options that we have in that mid-price range for wildlife photography. So today what I wanted to do is compare these in a laboratory-like environment. It's really my living room of the place we're renting in California. But what it is it tests to see if this EF lens can match the sharpness of the zoom lens, which is really a phenomenally sharp lens, as I've mentioned probably 10 times already. And the reason why I do this is because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I want to know that the gear that I'm shooting can stand up to sharpness. And if I don't hit the right level of sharpness in the image, that it's my fault or the situation, and it's not the equipment that I'm shooting. And that's why laboratory tests like this, I call them laboratory tests, research scientists, but these types of tests are useful because they can tell us what the potential is of our equipment. What I've got is I've got a target here of a handful of books and a Fujifilm camera. It's about 10 feet away, maybe 12 feet away, and that's about the minimum focus distance, by the way, of the EF 400 f4. And I'm going to compare the sharpness here on the R5 and the R7, as well as with the 1.4x teleconverter mounted to the DO. And so we'll compare those on the computer, but I just wanted to walk you through the setup. All right, so now we've got all the images on my computer, and I have done no editing at all. All I did was open them up in Capture One, because I just prefer to do that for this sort of thing, and I outputted them as full-size JPEG files using the film simulation built-in profile in Capture One. So that's literally all I did with this. I outputted them and then brought them into Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to screen share here, and I will walk you through the results that I see. On the left, you're going to see the 100-500 throughout, and on the right, you're going to see the 400mm f4. Keep it simple. Two separate areas here. And then also I'm going to show you the roughly 22% resolution, which is what I had to do in order to get both side by side for the full frame. And then I'll zoom into 200% and we will do some serious pixel peeping. Now on pixel peeping, this is not about pixel peeping. This is about pixel peeping so that we understand how the lenses perform when they're in the field. What I'm doing is throughout all the images, I'm keeping ISO at 100 because that'll be the sharpest possible. And I'm adjusting the shutter speed to adjust the exposure so that it's appropriate. I turned off image stabilization for both lenses for all of these applications. I put it on a countertop, I allowed it to settle, and I did a 10-second timer to eliminate any sort of shake from my initiation of the shutter. Okay, so it's a pretty good test, I think, but I share that with you just so you understand what I'm doing. Two observations when we're looking at it, wide open here, and at 400mm. The first is that, to my eye, and this may be because I have it in my head, I do think the contrast is a little bit better on the RF 100-500. You do see with the DO lens a little bit of wanting when it comes to contrast. So for example, if you look at the darkness here kind of around Ed Yong, this book, great book by the way, if you're interested in reading it. But you look at the blue and the greenish blue, the turquoise here in both images, you can see just it's a little bit more robust, the color and the depth to the contrast. So that's something we can adjust in post pretty easily, so it's not something that's a huge issue, but I do point it out. The other thing to note is we do see different depth of field. So, in the background here you can see, I think this is a plant. So you can see the plant here and the outline of the plant ever so slightly here, whereas when you shoot at f4, that's completely obliterated into the background. All right, let's go over to 200% so we can compare the two. So what I'm doing is, again, everything's exactly the same. We're just zooming in on that image so we can see it at 200%. Now, to my eye, I'm a little actually surprised because in the field I've been a little bit frustrated with the EF 400mm f4, but it's pretty clear here to me that the EF 400mm f4 is sharper, even wide open at f4, than the RF 100-500. And it shows up particularly here, when you look at the letters here. There's more definition in the texture, these little circles that you can see that make up each of the letters in this line of text is just sharper than here. You can make out more of the details. So you can also see a little bit of that here kind of in these layers as well, the kind of pigmentation here on the blue. I will say they are very, very close, and that is perhaps, you can look at that both ways, but I'd say that's actually a good thing for the EF lens because the RF 100-500 is extraordinarily sharp. Now we're going to be comparing more of an apples to apples. So the left photo here is exactly the same. This is the 100-500 at f6.3, which is wide open. But now I've adjusted the aperture on the EF 400mm f4 from f4 to f6.3, so that we're comparing what it would be like apples to apples comparison. Again, 22%, and here let's look in at 200% here. So again, I find that the EF lens is at par or a little bit sharper. You can see more definition in like all the little like dots here in the background of the text. I don't think that this is that much sharper than it is wide open. It seems to be performing at peak performance at wide open. I just noticed that I did not adjust this caption here, but trust me, this is 6.3. Okay, the next thing I wanted to test was maximum focal length. So on the left here, we're looking at 500 millimeters now. We've extended the RF 100-500 out to its maximum. It's 500 millimeters f7.1. And what I've done is thrown the 1.4x Mark III teleconverter on the EF 400 millimeter for a focal length of 560 millimeters. I'm shooting again wide open at 5.6. So this is what I would want to do in the field, what I want to be capable of in order to get the most out of this lens. You'll notice the field of view is different because I've zoomed in more. There is more background blur here, and again, we're seeing the same thing in loss of contrast in the EF 400 millimeter. I just want to boost up. I didn't edit these, but I just want to boost up that contrast a little bit to make it a little bit more punchy. So here, let's zoom in at 200% and really compare these two. So here, I'm not adjusting the field of view, so you're seeing it's zoomed in a little bit more on the EF lens on the right because we're looking at 560 millimeters instead of 500. Now, again, to my eye, I see them as very, very similar. In this case, I might give a slight edge to the 100-500. It looks a little bit more defined here, in the text than it does here, though you can still pick up the inner circles and, of the text here. And I think it's pretty close, and it's a good performance for the EF lens to be able to maintain that clarity even with the 1.4x teleconverter. Here, though, I've adjusted the resolution a little bit. So we have the resolution of the RF lens is at 200%, just like it was before. I've now backed out the resolution of the EF lens when the teleconverter is on there to 160% in order to have a similar field of view for our cropped image. And in this case, again, I give a slight edge, even with that kind of adjustment of resolution to the 100-500. It looks a little sharper, but I honestly, they look very comparable to me. And I don't know, I kind of go back and forth. You really look in there, take off the glasses, and it looks, I don't know, maybe like the EF lens is slightly sharper. So it's pretty similar. So I'd say the image performance, the quality is really on par, even with the 1.4x teleconverter on the EF lens, which is, again, kind of a good thing. Okay, so the final test I wanted to do was do the exact same sort of evaluation, but throw it on the R7 instead of the R5. Now the R7 has that 1.6x crop factor, which is really nice. It's cropping into the inner circle of the lens image circle. And so we're really demanding a lot from that smaller segment of the lens. So taken kind of in a big picture here, again shooting at 400, same as the first test we did just on the R7. They look pretty similar to me. I think you might be able to detect some differences. Again, we see more depth of field. Like this is the chair. It's not a chair. I don't know what that is. Oh no, it's just the side of the book. That's the book here. So you can see the book is blurred out, even the depth of field at like 12 feet. You know, the back of the book, which is curling up, is already blurred out here at f4, whereas at f 6.3, you can see a little bit more definition there. So we do see that depth of field difference, which we'd expect. Again, it looks like the contrast is a little bit better on the R5, or sorry, on the RF lens, but that's also kind of well established at this point in our discussion. So let's go ahead and look at 200%, really getting a lot out of the lens here and trying to get the most possible. So I'm going to take off the glasses for this as well. Okay, this is actually not what I expected. So I've been shooting this lens, the EF 400, on the R7, and I don't know, I've been kind of disappointed with the performance in terms of sharpness and acuity, but it looks like it's more of a technique issue or something to do with the autofocus or image stabilization. It's not the lens. So what we can see here is when we're looking wide open, f4 400 millimeters on that lens versus 400 millimeters f6.3 on the R7 100-500. There is no question in my mind that 200% the EF lens is sharper. The prime is looking more defined here. It's a lot less fuzzy actually than the RF 100-500. And you see a lot more definition in the letters on the EF lens than you do on the 100-500. So that's interesting to me. I mean, what that suggests to me actually is that any issues I'm having, you know, they may still have to do with the lens, that's possible, but it may be driven more by image stabilization, which I do tend to use in the field, or it could be some sort of autofocus functionality. I did notice in doing these tests that the RF 100-500 was a lot more punchy in the autofocus. I mean, it just zoomed in, it just got autofocus locked on the book and was done. Whereas the EF lens would cycle a little bit. It needed a little bit more contrast in the image, in the focus point where it was focused on to grab on. And it's just not quite as quick. So, you know, it may be something to do with the autofocus system. So I need to do a little bit more testing, but, you know, as far as I'm concerned, when you look at these two lenses now in this test, I guess I'm kind of happy, to be honest with you, because this suggests to me that the lens I have is a very sharp specimen. The RF 100-500 has really made me quite happy. It's a very sharp lens. This EF lens looks quite sharp and even a little bit more sharp than the zoom lens, which I would hope for, I would expect in a normal prime. But because this DO lens, the DO lens, diffractive optics lens, was a little bit of an experimental thing for Canon, I was a little concerned that it wouldn't perform quite as well. Other reviews I've seen, like Christopher Frosch, who I respect a lot, found that on a Sony body that was the APS-C crop, it didn't perform as well. I mean, these results would suggest to me that it's performing quite well, at least my particular copy. So I hope this is all helpful for you. I've gotten a lot of questions about this lens, and yeah, I'm looking forward to your comments below. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.